Thank you for coming to my presentation. I know you all traveled a long way to get here. So we're going to talk today about the Multimedia Principle, multimedia content in the classroom, applications and assessment, value, ease, and practicality by Jeff Downs. So multimedia content instruction is really most recently by Meyer in 2017. He synthesized all these concepts together and he brought us the Multimedia Principle, which states that students will learn better when lessons are presented with content that includes words and pictures. So this is a typical student studying out of textbooks getting kind of frustrated, where this representation shows students obviously very excited about learning through the computer. Now, I can understand that as well, but I mean, we can tend to make things much more exciting when we can present it with other content. One of the first principles that are addressed in Multimedia Principle is the Spatial Contiguity Principle. This says when there is an image on a screen, having text with that image is better when the text is located nearby. So in this representation, we have letters A, B, and C next to the different processes of evaporation and rain and so on. But the description of what's happening is over here off to the side. Now, in the other case here, to the right, we have the description next to each process, and this brings it together better. In the first case, students would have to go between looking at the part, looking at the letter, and then associating it with where we are over here, and then trying to bring that connection. Peck and Sorvanos in 2017 conducted a study to test this. In their study, they were looking at subconscious learning using spatial contiguity. Participants were presented several different slides to look at with several different conditions. And this was about relating the Arabic numerals that we know, 1 through 9, to the Chinese equivalents. So in the beginning, they did conduct a pre-test to eliminate students or participants who would be familiar with the Chinese characters. And then they presented 3 different presentations. One would have the Chinese symbol with the number nearby, one would be the Chinese symbol, the number spaced out, and the third would be the Chinese symbol with no number present at all. A post-test was conducted where they had to do a matching, and they checked both time and the number of clicks it took them to get it completed. No big surprise, this verified the contiguity principle in that the students who had the Chinese symbol with the Arabic numeral nearby did far better than the rest. So here's an example of the field they used. So the Chinese symbol would show up here, and if they didn't have any numbers present, there would be no numbers showing up, but in the matching part they'd have to then try to guess. In the case where they had the symbol and the information far away, it would look like this. In the third case, they would have the Chinese symbol and the number nearby. This one represents the spatial contiguity principle. And students did much better with this one. Brazier et al. In 2019 conducted a study to measure the location of information as well. So they presented students with one of 4 versions of a lesson. And they gave the students a post-test and a delayed post-test, which was 3 weeks later, to test how well they had learned the content. This was to measure which one was most effective. So in the first condition, the lesson would include some type of animation. In my representation, the cheetah represents animation, it's moving there. And the question represents when the questions occurred. So in this one, we would have the animation, and then we'd have questions that would occur as the topics were presented. In the next case, the animation would occur within the lesson, and then the questions would occur after the lesson. In the third case, questions occurred as the information was delivered, but the animation occurred after the lesson. And in the final case, as you might guess, what's left is to have the animation in the post-lesson period along with the questions. So which one did best? A lot of people thought that what would be best is the animation within the lesson. Well, after the delayed test was taken 3 weeks following, what happened was the students who had the animation and the quiz at the very end did the best. And the people who did second best, it was a close second best, were the students who had the animation and the questions again together, but in the beginning. So this result was the best, and this result was the second best. Okay. Now another principle is the modality principle. Modality principle states that students will learn better when information is presented in spoken form versus a written or textual form, if there's going to be some kind of imagery. And this is to indicate what we're talking about. Spoken, so you're hearing it and you're seeing the pictures. And the idea here is that your eye is able to focus on the image and your ears are able to focus on the hearing, and that you have that split attention, but that's okay because you're not having to split the attention with your eyes. That's the modality principle. So Koch, Janka et al. In 2019 conducted a study, but they focused on, there are 3 types of learning. There's auditory, visual, and kinesthetic, but their focus was just on the auditory and visual. I just like the graphic, so I thought I'd share that with you. So they're studying the modality principle with various learners. They presented a lesson with various conditions, but the results actually surprised them. Visual learners, so they were able to split it off between auditory and visual learners. Visual learners learned best when information was presented with static imagery and text that was in written form. So it wasn't what we would expect with the modality principle that says they'll learn better with static imagery and audio. So here are the 4 different conditions that people were exposed to. I used a cheetah here that's still for my static image, and of course the animation for the moving cheetah is the animation representation. This is my representation for text, and then this is my representation for audio. So we have our 4 cases there. So going against other research about the modality principle, they determined that visual learners, now this is for visual learners, learn best with static images and text. So the visual learner, the static image, and the text was best. And second best was the visual learner with the animation and the text. And the idea here is that for learners who are visual learners, to hear something, they're actually having to do an extra process of converting those words to images from sound and then visualizing that. For auditory learners, there was no significant difference between any of the cases. Static, dynamic, text, or audio. Now, Schwepp and Rummer in 2016 conducted a study. This was independent of the Koch-Janka et al. Study. But this verified the results. They had the same thing happen, that long-term learning occurred with students who saw a static image and text was written. And the rationalization here of what's going on is that a lot of these principles were established a while ago and are still held up. But students may have evolved. They may be to the point that they are okay image and reading text and getting it down versus seeing it and hearing it. So another part of having multimedia content is assessing that content, is to make sure that it's effective content. Now, some people choose to use pre-test and post-tests. Others might use surveys, while still others might choose a rubric to analyze if it's been an effective technique or lesson or even course. So let's talk a little bit about pre and post tests. Now, some researchers conduct both pre-test and post-test for assessing the content in a lesson or even a course. You want to know what the students know before they take it and how much they may have gained after they've taken that course. Some schools, my own included, conduct post-tests at the end of terms for, well, in our case, math, English, even some other classes like history, and so on, just to chart if overall the course is effective. That one's not measured against a pretest, but the point of it is to assess, in general, is that department meeting the student needs? It's part of our accreditation plan in my school. But this does not need to be a complicated process. Now, researchers using pre and post tests in their assessments, many I've talked about tonight already, when they're doing their study. Brazier et al. In 2019 uses pre-test and post-test to measure if it's effective. Paik and Sarvanos in 2017, as well as Kakyanka et al. 2019. Schwepp and Rummer also use pre-test and post-tests. So creating a pre-test and a post-test does not need to be difficult. Again, you can do it for a single lesson, for a module or a chapter that you might have created, or you can do it for your entire course. Rashid and Lau, 2020, designed a pre and post test to measure how much students would take from a lesson on medical information. So they did a pre-test and they asked categorizing questions to put people into different groups as to what they might know, prior knowledge, and so on. The pre-test was asked questions on the topic of what was going to be presented. Then there was a 3-day seminar where they had information presented about this topic. Following the seminar, they conducted a post-test. And this was to measure how much people took from this presentation. Was it effective? Should it be changed? What should be changed for the next time? Now the post-test, though, asked questions that were only about the topic covered in the presentation. Well, the pre-test asked categorizing questions and information about the topic. The post-test only asked questions that were about the topic. So another way to measure effectiveness of some kind of presentation or some type of lesson done in a classroom or even a course is a survey. Survey says, okay, here's my humor for the day. So, surveys. Many things can be assessed using a survey. You can do lessons, modules or chapters again, courses, programs, even schools. Most schools, including Liberty University and my college and pretty much every place I've been, they have end-of-course surveys. And this would talk about the effectiveness of the course and the instructor, the textbook used, Were the lessons good? Was response time what you expected when you have questions from the instructor? Zhang et al. In 2020 conducted a study, a very interesting study, and I referenced this in a lesson that I created inspired by them. And I'll talk about that towards the end of tonight's presentation. So they were measuring student satisfaction with the learning process. They conducted the survey to see how effective was that process. Did it work out, or was this kind of a waste of time? And maybe the students got a little irritated by having to go through it. Now, creating a survey does not need to be challenging. Just like doing pre and post tests, creating a survey, you're trying to ask questions just to see how things are. How do people feel about the process? Survey designers need to consult the material being evaluated, so that's an important piece of it. What the people thought about the material, what they thought about the process, what they think about the overall program. Dugan et al. In 2021 designed a survey to evaluate employees' needs in relation to healthcare options. In the development of the survey they had 12 areas of questions and 26 measurements. So when you're going to create a survey, you want to think about what are the areas you're going to cover, and then you can ask questions, more detailed questions about those areas. So not every survey is going to work for every situation. They're going to be pretty unique, but you determine what you're after and you ask those questions. In higher education, other traits need to be considered. Content of the class, course objectives being met or not being met, timeliness of grading, student-instructor interaction and student-and-student interaction, and that could be in many ways. That could be considered like through emails, we use Canvas, and a learning management system has typically an email system. It could also be emails with the instructor, it could be a discussion board. I encourage all my students to communicate with each other through the discussion board. But survey length should be considered. Now, in designing the survey at my college, we were very careful to include faculty in that process. So the end of course survey, we all had a say in it, so we know what's going to be expected of us as instructors. And that's a critical part of constructing these. But caution, here's my little caution animation. Survey length is important. If you give a survey that's too long, people are more likely to not do it. Or they get into it and realize after the first page they're 2% done. Like, oh, okay, I'm not going to do this for another 49 pages or whatever. So watch the survey length, don't make it too long. You could also turn people off of future surveys when you're looking for participants. Survey frequency is also a concern. For accreditation purposes, my institution conducts surveys to ask various questions about student satisfaction, about climate of the college, and more recently we're going to conduct a survey. We have one just go out. We want to have another one go out to talk about creating a diversity center. So we're not going to do that one for at least a month because we don't want to have too many surveys. Survey saturation's a problem. Now, another way to assess things, assess content, is through a rubric. So rubrics are used by many institutions and groups. There's even professional groups available that will organize rubrics, organize the whole process of assessing content and running that. It can be done by small groups of reviewers, doesn't require a big committee, doesn't require a whole class of people, and you don't have a long time frame between the surveys. You also don't have to wait for students to do a pre-test and a post-test. So unlike surveys where you'd have to maybe give it a 2-week window, you wouldn't have to do that. You can get it done in a couple of days. With as opposed to the pre and post test, that might be between 8 and 15 weeks before you're going to get the information to analyze. So there are professional reviewing organizations. Quality Matters is one of them. We've used Quality Matters at my institution before. They maintain up-to-date rubrics, and that's a very important part. As technology changes, what we're looking for in those classes change as well. As our students change, we're looking for content that's going to be more up-to-date, more effective with students. So they'll maintain an up-to-date rubric. Their rubrics are used to evaluate online and e-learning courses. But a really neat feature of theirs is that they're going to bring in peer reviewers to work with the faculty both in building their course and in evaluating the course. When I've had my courses go through Quality Matters, I had 2 faculty members from a local community college, one of our sister schools, as well as we had someone from the country. So I had 3 reviewers, and it was a really nice process that they were able to look together at what I had, give me suggestions on what to improve, and then go from there. In Quality Matters, the rubric has 41 standards they look at, spread throughout 19 elements. So this can be a little robust. I mean, it's going to be pretty involved, but it is a thorough thing, and it gives us a national standard. And also a nice little feature about this program is you get a badge that you get to put with your course. So when people open their course, they say, oh, it's a Quality Matters course. Now, when you are creating a rubric, you don't have to do Quality Matters. You can do something that's specific to your institution. But your tool needs to be valid. You need a valid tool. And a valid tool is one that addresses the content or what's involved in the lesson or the course, and it's going to make sure it covers the topics or objectives that are in the course. What is being presented? What is the goal? That tool is valid if it covers those goals. It also needs to be a reliable tool. And to check reliability, you have to test it with different users. And what you're looking for is consistent results in the inter-rater testing. So you want to make sure that when people test it, they're going to come out not identical results, but you don't want differences. If it's on a 1 to 3 scale, you don't want lots of 1s and lots of 3s in the same categories. Adelson and Barber in 2016 created a test. It was a valid test. It was a rubric, and it was a valid rubric that covered content of the courses. Now, they took that rubric and they gave it to 8 educators, some instructors, some administrators, but all in the education process, and they had them rate 5 different courses. Now, their rubric failed because of inter-rater reliability. The differences were too great amongst the raters. And they paired them off, and they got lots of 1s and 3s, and so it wasn't a reliable tool. One part that was determined that could be why it wasn't reliable is that the rubric was built after the courses. So they took existing courses and applied a new rubric that they built. Whereas it's much more effective if you're able to build a course following a rubric that already exists. Zhang et al., I'm inspired by these researchers, they created a rubric. We talked about them a little earlier. They also used a survey to analyze how effective it was. So they showed students an example of a rubric and gave students an assignment to create videos. And then after that process went through and students got to see the results and how things were graded, they went and they built a new rubric with the students, where these students had input, they collaborated, and with the guidance of the instructor, they created a new rubric. And with that new rubric, they did another video assignment. Now the product in that one was much better than what it was the first time. They created better videos, and their satisfaction was also much higher. They were part of this, they had ownership in the process, and so they felt that this is something that they knew what they were doing and they liked what they created. So contents of a rubric. De Battista did a thorough study on rubrics. He used both Quality Matters as an inspiration, as well as several institutions in studying what they did for their rubrics, and he came up with a very comprehensive rubric. He rated several areas, including student needs being addressed, welcome for students on our front page, which is actually a thing that's in my classes. I have a welcome video for my students. Learning assessments, of course, you're going to have tests, quizzes, and all that. It doesn't have to be a test or quiz. It could be some kind of a project that someone does that illustrates that they are well aware of the concepts. Also, are there opportunities for student and student-instructor interactions? He also checked in his rubric, quality of instruction material. Is it well done? Or is it just read this, do this assignment, read this, do this assignment? Is there more to it than just the very basics? Is there follow-up support by the instructor? Does the instructor grade things in a reasonable time? Ours is between 2 days and 1 week. That material should be graded. And then how is the technology going to be incorporated into the course and utilized? Is there a grade book? To me, a grade book is one of the most helpful tools. Students know where they are. And if I forgot to put it in a homework assignment, they can tell me. And I can update that. And I appreciate that. Also, are student evaluations present? Now, rubrics can be used when you're building a course or when you're doing a periodic review of a course. Typically, it's a good idea to review a course every 5 to 7 years. As standards change, you want to make sure the course is meeting those standards. Also, you want to be able to rate categories. Now, in De Battista's case, it didn't provide a scale for rating, and I would suggest probably a 3-point scale. 1 for poor, 3 for good, 2 for moderate. So 3-point scale is a good way to get it. It's not going to take the reviewer too long to come up with those values. And any rubric should, again, be tested for reliability prior to being used. Again, it's best to apply the rubric if it was designed prior to the course being built and that the course is built knowing the expectations on the course by the designer. Now, the lesson I came up with for this, and I don't want to be, it's not plagiarism. I will cite that I use Zhang et al. In the development of this, and there are differences to it, but it was a very inspirational lesson. I do plan to incorporate this into my class in the fall. So students view a TikTok video about the circumference of the Earth by Eratosthenes of Cyrene. And there's a link here. It's kind of nice to be able to show that. I'm not going to click on the link, but I can share that with you later on if you'd like to see it. But the TikTok link goes into a really neat example of how trigonometry was used to calculate the circumference of the Earth over 2,000 years ago. So from this opener, now students are starting to think, oh, their attention is grabbed, and then they're going to take a pretest for knowledge. And the pretest I'd probably throw in there for this lesson. I'm going to make sure they know their SOHCAHTOA. I'm also going to make sure they know the law of sines and law of cosines. Now, following that, students will be taught the Multimedia Principle that we already discussed, Spatial Contiguity, and the Modality Principle. Next, I would teach students about rubrics, and I would present them with an initial rubric, and I already have that created for them. Uh-oh. The students review and rate the videos based on the rubric. And I have a sample video that I think really captures the heart of what I'm after, and it's a SOHCAHTOA video where students can learn about what Those means sine opposite over hypotenuse, cosine opposite over, or adjacent over hypotenuse, and so on. So then students will get a video creating assignment. So I feel like something got messed up here. But students are going to be part of creating the rubric for their assignment. And their assignment is to create a TikTok video to demonstrate the law of sines or law of cosines. So students are going to work with the instructor to create this video. The instructor, me, will work with students and help them understand how to use their phones in this process. And they'll be put in groups of 2 to 4. So the multimedia assessment, so feedback and assessments are provided. They're going to use the rubric that we developed as a group in scoring that. And then students will demonstrate that they know these concepts by coming to the board and working a few problems. Show me law of sines. Show me law of cosines. I'm also going to encourage them to share these videos beyond TikTok. They can embed those TikTok videos both in Instagram and other platforms. So in conclusion, multimedia content in education is important. It can greatly improve what students are learning and how they're learning. It's important to consider the established principles, the Multimedia Principle, the Spatial Contiguity Principle, and the Modality Principle when included. However, it's also important to know that a lot of people are adapting and evolving as time goes on. You know, we just had students for a year working on Zoom, working remotely, or Teams, or whatever kind of program they're using. And so this is going to be really interesting in the next few years to determine how has that affected learning. So we probably need to adjust our teaching styles to their new learning styles that they've been required to learn. This should be reviewed for effectiveness. Whatever we bring out to them should be reviewed for effectiveness through an assessment, through pre and post tests, through surveys, or through rubrics. So when we build a rubric, make sure it's a valid and reliable tool. Make sure that there's a rating system in there. And that's about it. Are there any questions today? Following, I have a list of the references I've used for this presentation. And you are welcome to get a list. I have the list printed out here. I'll give you a list of these, as well as I have a list of all the images used in this presentation. I can get you a copy of that as well. So thank you.